In the Pacific theater of World War II, one of the most brutal and relentless campaigns was unfolding. The United States, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, was engaged in an island-hopping strategy that aimed to push the Japanese Empire ever closer to its home islands. Each island, though small and seemingly insignificant on the world map, was a vital stepping stone towards victory. Yet each island was heavily defended, and capturing them was far from simple. The Japanese, having dug in across vast stretches of Pacific islands, relied on an intricate system of fortifications, many of which were thought to be impenetrable. The year was 1944. The Pacific War was reaching its peak. The U.S. Navy had achieved decisive victories at places like Midway and the Philippines, and the U.S. Marines had become the spearhead of American offensives. After successful landings on the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Mariana Islands, the next challenge was to conquer the island of Saipan. To do so, the 3rd Marine Division, among others, was deployed. They were faced with a daunting task: eliminate 16 heavily fortified Japanese bunkers that had been constructed in the rugged hills and dense jungles of the island. These bunkers were connected by tunnels, with intricate networks designed to withstand artillery fire and bomb strikes. Corporal John Taylor, a 23-year-old Marine from Ohio, was assigned to the mission. He was an experienced soldier, having participated in several skirmishes since joining the Marine Corps 2 years earlier. Taylor wasn't just a Marine. He was a product of the Corps' famed training, which had turned young men from all walks of life into deadly, disciplined soldiers. The Marines were a brotherhood, built on honor, courage, and commitment. Taylor embodied all three. The 3rd Marine Division, which Taylor was a part of, was one of the most battle-hardened units in the Pacific. It had fought on Guadalcanal, the first major offensive by the U.S. in the Pacific, and had seen firsthand the horrors of jungle warfare. By 1944, after years of intense combat, the division had become adept at executing complex maneuvers and adapting to the difficult terrain of the islands they were tasked with capturing. The Marines had become experts in close-quarters combat, where they would storm the enemy's positions with bayonets, grenades, and rifles. But this mission in particular was going to be different. The 16 bunkers the Japanese had built on this island were designed to withstand the Marines' traditional tactics. Heavy artillery, mortar strikes, and bombing runs from American aircraft had already been attempted with little success. The bunkers remained standing, their steel-reinforced walls untouched by the bombardment. The Japanese had learned from the battles that preceded them. They understood that they could not afford to lose ground. Their strategy was simple: hold each position as long as possible, forcing the Americans into a prolonged battle that would eventually sap their strength. This tactic had worked for the Japanese at places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where the defenders held out until the bitter end. But this time the U.S. had a different approach: sheer perseverance, supported by an innovation that would change the course of the battle: the M1A1 bazooka. The M1A1 bazooka was a 2-man rocket launcher that had been designed to penetrate the thick concrete and steel used in the construction of Japanese fortifications. Unlike the standard rifle or machine gun, which could do little against the formidable bunker defenses, the bazooka was capable of launching a high-velocity rocket that could tear through the walls of a bunker, rendering it useless. It was an invention that was proving to be revolutionary for the Marines, but it came with its own challenges. The weapon was heavy, cumbersome, and required precise coordination between the 2 Marines using it. One would operate the launcher, while the other would serve as a spotter, directing the fire and making sure that the rocket hit its intended target. For Corporal Taylor, the M1A1 bazooka was both a blessing and a burden. It was the weapon that could tip the scales in favor of the Marines, but it was also a weapon that required close-range confrontation with the enemy. To effectively use it, Taylor and his spotter would need to get within a few hundred yards of the enemy positions, far too close for comfort. The jungle would provide some cover, but it would also limit their movement. The Japanese defenders, entrenched in their bunkers, were skilled marksmen, and they would be quick to react to any movement. Taylor's squad was well aware of the danger. They had seen their comrades fall in previous battles, and they knew this one would not be any easier. There was no glory in storming fortified bunkers, only the grim determination to survive and secure victory for their country. As the Marines gathered at the base of the hill leading to the bunkers, the men were silent, knowing the brutal work ahead. The sun had barely risen, and already the air was thick with humidity. The heat of the jungle pressed in on them, making it hard to breathe. The familiar scent of sweat and gun oil filled the air, a stark reminder of the constant tension. Before the assault began, Taylor had a moment to himself. He stood at the edge of the jungle, looking out over the landscape. The island was peaceful, with only the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves breaking the silence. It was hard to imagine that within hours, this tranquil place would become a battleground once again. Pause. He thought about his family back home, the life he had left behind when he enlisted. He thought about the friends he had made in the Corps, men who had become his brothers over the past 2 years. But now his thoughts had to remain focused on the mission. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. At 0700 hours, the order to advance came. The Marines moved out, single file, through the dense jungle. The sound of boots crunching on the underbrush was the only noise they made. The jungle itself seemed to swallow their movements, and the world felt distant, as if the battle hadn't yet begun. Taylor's mind raced as he thought about the task ahead. Would they be able to breach the bunkers with the M1A1 bazooka? Would they be able to hold their position long enough to take down the enemy? As they neared the enemy's position, the first shots rang out. The Japanese, hidden in their positions, had been watching the Marines' every move. A burst of machine gun fire erupted from the first bunker, followed by the sound of a mortar shell exploding just behind the Marines. The battle had begun. Pause. The Marines took cover, ducking behind rocks and trees, returning fire as best they could. But the first wave of attacks failed to make a dent in the Japanese defenses. Taylor knew that the only way to break the stalemate was to close the distance and bring the bazooka to bear. The Marines had to advance, or they would be stuck in this firefight for days, losing precious lives with every passing hour. The calm before the storm had ended, and the real battle was about to begin. Taylor's heart pounded as he gripped the M1A1 bazooka. It was time for action, and there was no turning back now. The fate of his squad and the success of the entire mission rested in his hands. The Japanese bunkers were waiting, but Taylor was ready to face them head-on. The storm of battle had begun. By 0730 hours, the Marines had begun to move into their assault positions. The jungle, dense with foliage, hindered their progress, and the thick, humid air felt oppressive against their skin. Every step forward was a struggle. The sound of enemy fire rang out intermittently, each burst of gunfire a reminder of the danger that lay ahead. The Marines knew they had little time to waste. Every minute spent advancing towards the heavily fortified positions of the Japanese would bring them closer to the inevitable confrontation. Corporal Taylor, his heart pounding in his chest, led his squad as they crept forward through the jungle. His mind was focused, cutting through the noise of fear and uncertainty. Taylor had seen battle before, but this was different. There was something about this mission that felt heavier. Perhaps it was the immensity of the task. Neutralizing 16 reinforced bunkers, each designed to withstand direct artillery strikes, was no small feat. The Japanese defenders inside those bunkers had proven to be tenacious, holding their ground in previous engagements. The Marines knew that without a breakthrough, the assault would become a costly war of attrition. Taylor's eyes scanned the landscape as he moved, taking in the subtle details of the surroundings. The heavy silence of the jungle had given way to the occasional crack of a distant gunshot. The Japanese had likely heard them coming, and their alertness only added to the tension. Every movement felt as though it could trigger a sudden eruption of violence. Yet the Marines pressed on, each step a calculated risk. The element of surprise was no longer on their side, and the Japanese were prepared to fight tooth and nail for their position. Taylor could feel the weight of the decision on his shoulders. This wasn't just about neutralizing the bunkers, it was about survival, for both his squad and the entire operation. At 0800 hours, the Marines reached a ridge that provided a clear view of the first two bunkers. The bunkers, nestled in the rough hills, stood as silent monuments to the Japanese defenders' resolve. Built with thick concrete walls and reinforced with steel, the bunkers were nearly indestructible by conventional means. Taylor could see the machine gun positions poking out from the tops of the structures. Japanese soldiers, barely visible, were likely manning the defenses, waiting for any sign of movement. Pause. Taylor knew that they would be met with a fierce barrage of fire if they attempted to advance any closer. Their chances of success hinged on the bazooka's ability to penetrate the concrete, and that would require a direct hit at close range. The tension in the air was palpable. For a brief moment, the world seemed to slow down. Taylor's grip on the M1A1 bazooka tightened as he surveyed the scene. Behind him, his squad crouched low in the jungle, watching for any signs of movement from the enemy. Sweat dripped from their brows, and each soldier knew that their next steps could mean life or death. Taylor felt the burden of command press down on him. He had been in tight situations before, but never with so much at stake. The pressure was immense, but there was no time for hesitation. The Marines had come too far to turn back now. The first challenge was to get into range. The jungle provided some cover, but it was far from ideal. Taylor had to get close enough to launch the bazooka without exposing himself or his squad to enemy fire. The Japanese defenders had the upper hand in the terrain. Their positions were built into the natural hills, giving them a clear view of the Marines' approach. The Marines, on the other hand, had to make their way through the dense undergrowth, barely able to see more than a few feet in front of them. Suddenly, the stillness of the jungle was shattered by the crack of a sniper's rifle. The bullet struck a tree just inches from one of Taylor's men, sending a shower of bark and debris into the air. The shot had been a warning. The Japanese were aware of their presence, and the battle was about to intensify. The Marines immediately took cover, diving behind the trees and rocks that dotted the landscape. Machine gun fire erupted from one of the bunkers, sending streams of tracer rounds whizzing through the air. It was clear that the Japanese were prepared for a long fight. Taylor's thoughts raced as he realized that the initial assault had failed. The Marines couldn't advance while under heavy fire, and the Japanese were well entrenched in their positions. The element of surprise was gone, and the enemy's positions were too well defended to approach directly. Pause. The squad was stuck in a deadly stalemate, caught in the crossfire with no clear path forward. At this moment, Taylor knew they had to act quickly or risk losing momentum. The rest of the squad was pinned down, and every passing minute brought more danger. If they couldn't neutralize the first bunker, they would be vulnerable to a counterattack. But Taylor's mind remained focused on the task at hand. The M1A1 bazooka was their best chance, but it could only be effective if they could get within range. That meant taking the fight to the Japanese. Without warning, Taylor motioned to Corporal Smith, his spotter, and began to move forward. The two Marines crept through the jungle, each movement deliberate and cautious. The sound of their footsteps seemed deafening in the stillness. As they advanced, Taylor's heart raced. He knew this was the moment of truth. Every step brought them closer to the first bunker, and the risk grew with every second. But there was no turning back now. The jungle was alive with the sounds of battle. The crack of sniper rifles, the rapid fire of machine guns, and the occasional explosion filled the air. The enemy was closing in, and Taylor's squad had no choice but to fight for every inch of ground. They were caught in a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the Japanese defenders holding the upper hand in the terrain. Pause. But Taylor had something the Japanese didn't expect. The M1A1 bazooka, a weapon capable of changing the tide of battle in an instant. The Marines had reached a small rise, and Taylor could see the first bunker clearly. The machine gun nest on top of the bunker was already firing, and the Japanese defenders had spotted them. This was it. There was no more waiting. Taylor aimed the bazooka carefully, taking a deep breath to steady his hand. He knew that a single, well-placed shot could destroy the first bunker and give the Marines the breakthrough they so desperately needed. Taylor pulled the trigger. The rocket shot forward, leaving a trail of smoke in its wake. By 1100 hours, the assault had entered its most perilous phase. The Japanese defenders, reeling from the destruction of their first bunker, quickly regrouped. The shock from Taylor's initial attack was short-lived. The remaining bunkers were still heavily fortified, and the defenders, though shaken, were far from defeated. The Marines were now locked in a vicious fight for survival. Taylor and his squad had made a significant breakthrough, but they were not out of danger yet. The cost of success would come at a steep price. Taylor's squad, emboldened by the success of the first strike, pushed forward, moving from cover to cover. But the Japanese had been quick to recover. They had learned from their earlier mistakes, and their fire now became even more intense. Machine gun fire, sniper rounds, and mortar explosions rained down on the Marines as they moved closer to the next set of bunkers. Pause. Taylor's heart raced as the air filled with the thunderous roar of artillery fire. His mind was focused solely on the task at hand. There could be no hesitation. As the sound of explosions and gunfire filled the jungle, the Marines advanced with their heads down, crawling through the underbrush. The trees, thick with vegetation, provided some cover, but the advancing squad was constantly exposed to enemy fire. The M1A1 bazooka was a powerful weapon, but it required precision. Taylor's squad couldn't risk making another assault without covering fire. The jungle had become a deadly labyrinth, with no clear paths and limited visibility. Every inch of ground gained was hard won, and every moment in the open was a gamble with death. Pause. Taylor's squad was pinned down by a series of mortar shells that exploded near their position, sending shrapnel flying in every direction. The Marines, despite their training, were human. They flinched, ducked, and scrambled to cover as explosions rang out like thunderclaps. In the chaos, Taylor's men had to fight not just the enemy, but also the terrain. The jungle, which had once seemed like a natural barrier to the enemy, was now a double-edged sword. It hid the Japanese positions, but also made it difficult for the Marines to move with any speed. It was at this moment that the cost of the assault began to hit home. One of the Marines, Private Daniels, had been hit by a sniper's bullet, the round piercing his shoulder and sending him crashing to the ground with a scream of pain. The squad immediately went into action, taking cover while the corpsman rushed to Daniels' side. Pause. Taylor's mind raced. He couldn't afford to lose any more men. They had to break the Japanese defenses, but at what cost? Daniels' injury was a grim reminder of the dangers they faced. Taylor had seen men die before, but there was something about the brutality of this battle that felt different. The stakes were high, and the more they advanced, the more desperate the situation became. The Japanese were digging in. The more the Marines pushed, the more the enemy dug in their heels. The remaining bunkers, though damaged, still stood firm. Taylor could feel the pressure mounting. He had to find a way to break this stalemate or risk losing more lives. Pause. The Japanese machine gunners were relentless, keeping the Marines pinned down behind cover. The sound of gunfire never stopped, and the air was thick with the smell of burning vegetation, smoke, and gunpowder. But Taylor, despite the mounting chaos, could feel something stirring within him. He couldn't let his men fall. He couldn't let them die without doing everything in his power to break the enemy's hold on the island. He had led them this far, and he wouldn't stop now. As the squad huddled behind a large rock, Taylor took a deep breath. He needed to move quickly, decisively. Every second they waited only allowed the Japanese to fortify their positions further. Without warning, Taylor sprang into action. He waved his hand to Corporal Smith, his spotter, signaling that they were moving up. Pause. The two of them, with the M1A1 bazooka in hand, moved swiftly through the jungle underbrush. They had no choice but to advance, their lives and the lives of their comrades depending on their success. The sound of enemy gunfire was deafening, but Taylor's focus remained unshaken. The first few steps were perilous, but with each step they took, Taylor and Smith closed the distance between them and the second set of bunkers. By the time they were within 100 yards of the next bunker, the Japanese had seen them. A barrage of machine gun fire erupted from the structure, and the air was filled with the sharp crack of bullets. Taylor's breath quickened, but he kept his focus on the task at hand. He reached the firing position for the bazooka and quickly aimed at the bunker. The enemy fire was relentless, but Taylor fired the rocket with precision. The blast rocked the jungle. The explosion sent debris flying and a plume of smoke into the air. For a moment, the sounds of battle seemed to stop. Taylor's eyes scanned the scene. The bunker had been breached. Pause. The Japanese defenders inside the bunker were disoriented, some thrown back by the force of the explosion, others trapped in the rubble. The blast had given Taylor's squad the opening they needed, but Taylor knew by 1200 hours, the momentum of the assault had begun to shift. Taylor and his squad had breached the first of the Japanese bunkers, but the situation remained far from secure. The enemy's remaining positions were spread across a wide area, each bunker designed to withstand everything from artillery strikes to direct bomb hits. But now the Marines had proven something that the Japanese could no longer ignore. Their defenses could be breached. After the first successful shot, Taylor's squad found themselves at a crossroads. The Japanese defenders were still holding strong in their remaining bunkers, and despite the destruction wrought by the bazooka, the enemy wasn't retreating. In fact, the battle had only intensified. The Marines were still under heavy fire from multiple directions, and with each passing minute, the Japanese were reinforcing their positions. Taylor knew that his squad's window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Every minute spent waiting would allow the Japanese to regroup and strengthen their resolve. If they were to break through, it had to happen now. The only option left was to continue pressing forward, even though it meant risking everything. The thought of failure was not an option. Too much was at stake. Pause. The jungle was alive with the sound of battle, but it wasn't just the firepower that rang out. The relentless heat of the Pacific sun, combined with the humidity, made the air feel thick, suffocating. The Marines, drenched in sweat and dirt, were fatigued beyond measure. They had already pushed through multiple lines of defense, and their energy was running low. But they had no choice. Taylor knew that as the leader, it was his responsibility to ensure that his men continued to fight with the same intensity as they had when the assault began. With a fierce determination that only a Marine could understand, Taylor made the call. He ordered his squad to advance. There was no turning back now. They had to finish what they started. Taylor's heart pounded as he led the charge. The M1A1 bazooka was heavy, and the jungle terrain made every movement cumbersome, but his resolve was unwavering. With Corporal Smith by his side, they moved forward, their path lit by the flare of enemy fire and the smoke of previous explosions. Every step was a gamble, and every corner of the jungle could hide a sniper, a machine gun, or worse. But Taylor and Smith pressed on, their eyes locked on the next target. The second bunker was in sight, and this time Taylor didn't hesitate. He took aim, his breathing steady despite the chaos around him. He fired. The rocket flew through the air, and with a thunderous explosion, the second bunker crumbled. The sound of the blast was deafening, but in the moments after, there was an eerie silence. The Japanese defenders had been caught off guard. The blast had left them reeling, but Taylor knew this moment was fleeting. He quickly reloaded the bazooka and moved on to the next target. The Marines, now emboldened by the success of the previous strikes, followed Taylor's lead. They pushed forward, each rocket fired a step closer to victory. But the Japanese were not finished. The remaining bunkers were deeply entrenched, and as Taylor and his squad moved in, the Japanese began to retaliate with even greater force. Mortar shells exploded around them, sending shrapnel and debris flying through the air. Pause. Taylor could feel the pressure mounting. His squad had already suffered losses, and they couldn't afford to lose more men. But there was no choice. They had to break the Japanese resistance or face the possibility of a prolonged and costly battle. The Marines moved from one bunker to the next, each explosion shaking the jungle and signaling another victory for the Americans. Yet with every bunker destroyed, the Japanese grew more desperate. Taylor could hear the Japanese yelling orders to their men, urging them to hold their ground at all costs. But Taylor's resolve was unshakable. He fired again, and the next bunker was obliterated. The sight of the Japanese defenders scrambling to save themselves in the aftermath of the explosion fueled Taylor's determination. With each bunker they destroyed, the tide of battle turned more in their favor. The Marines were pushing forward relentlessly, and it was clear that the Japanese were running out of options. In the midst of this fierce push, Taylor's squad reached the final bunkers. They had neutralized the majority of the enemy positions, but the last set of bunkers was the most heavily defended. Taylor's heart raced as he recognized the urgency of the situation. The Marines had suffered enough casualties, and there was no time to waste. The final push had to come now.